Today, I'm going to explain a drama mystery film called Berlin Syndrome. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. Claire Havel is on her way to Berlin on a train. She is a photographer from Brisbane, Australia, traveling to Germany to make a book. As she exits the station and gets to her room, she observes her surroundings, curiously looking at the buildings and stores around her. After a while, Claire leaves her room and heads to the rooftop, where people are drinking and having fun. The group invites Claire over and they spend the night together. In the morning, as everyone began to leave, Claire stays at the rooftop a bit longer to hang out and take some pictures of the buildings in the surrounding area. The next day, Claire goes out for a walk, and after buying some films and a dress, she goes to a bookstore. She's closely looking at a photo album when a man walking out of the store catches her attention. After finishing up in the bookstore, Claire walks outside and finds the man from earlier. He introduces himself as Andy Werner, an English teacher in a sports school. The two share a conversation, and they end up going to one of the many abandoned houses found in Berlin. As the pair talk to each other, Claire laughs at Andy when he mistakes the word complicate for contemplate. Moving on, Andy continues talking to Claire, asking about why she came to Berlin. She explains why, and the two drive away to Claire's home. When they arrive, Claire invites Andy over for a drink, but Andy declines as he has to meet with someone else. Claire stammers when Andy starts to touch her hair and slowly make his way, leaning in for a kiss. However, he suddenly stops, and the two part ways for now. Flustered, Claire gets to her room and checks her camera's photos. She sees one of Andy, and it makes her smile. The day after, Claire returns to the bookstore and is surprised to find Andy sitting there, looking at the album she was reading yesterday. Claire reaches for the album, but instead, her hand meets Andy's own. The two head for a bar and talk with each other again. Andy mentions the DDR, or the German Democratic Republic, how he thinks they're invalid, and that one could just suffocate anywhere. Claire then asks what the German word for suffocate is, but Andy mistakenly translates it and playfully chokes Claire to show her what it means. While this is going on, Andy notices Claire's necklace, which is a gift from her mother to keep her safe. Afterwards, the pair leaves and sets off for Andy's home. When they reach the apartment, Andy offers dinner while Claire stares out of the window. He then moves towards Claire from behind, reaching for her hands, and eventually, they start making love. Claire tries to suppress her moans, but Andy stops her, assuring her that no one will hear her from there. The next morning, the two lay in bed together and share a moment, telling each other that they never want this to end. In school, Andy discusses some quotes in his English class. When Andy mentions the book Giovanni's Room, one of his students named Franca recites. She observes that the book says that the character is constantly moving, feeling ashamed of himself, and finding himself, but in reality, he's just escaping. As Franca recites, Andy looks at her with a slight hint of frustration. Meanwhile, Claire is left at Andy's home. Wanting to leave, she tries the door, only to find it locked with a barrier covering the whole door. She then walks around the apartment, searching for a way to get out. When Andy arrives home, the two joke around with each other about locking Claire inside. Andy slyly mentions that next time, he'll tie Claire to the bed. Claire shrugs this off, and the two go out for a party before sleeping together. The next day, Claire asks for the key to the door, and Andy tells her that he'll leave it on the dresser. As they embrace each other, Andy wraps his arms around Claire tighter and stares at her with eyes full of obsession before eventually leaving for work. With Andy gone, Claire walks around the apartment and stumbles upon a photograph of herself with the word mine on her back, causing her to check herself. This is when she realizes that her necklace is gone. Starting to grow alarmed, Claire tries to escape, banging on the windows with the chairs, trying to open the door, and trying to call someone for help. During her attempt to flee, she sees that her SIM card has been taken out of the phone. When Andy arrives at home, he sees the mess Claire made and ignores her pleas to leave, only telling her that the windows are reinforced. Afraid and confused, Claire makes her way behind a chair, distancing herself from Andy before asking him what's going on. It becomes clear that Andy is growing frustrated, and he retorts that this is what she wanted. His words do nothing to ease her confusion, and Claire tries to explain that the words they say in bed don't always mean something. Andy only ignores her and instead, asks her what she wants for dinner. Again, Claire thinks of going outside, but Andy disagrees. This pushes Claire to throw a fit, and she asks Andy for her necklace, even starting to push him while he prepares dinner. In retaliation, Andy pins her down with ease and tells her again that no one can hear her from there. After that night, Andy walks into a school and enters a study hall where an ongoing discussion is being led by his father, Eric. He sits down and starts looking at some of the pictures he took of Claire naked and asleep when Eric suddenly calls him out for having contrary opinions about the DDR. Andy and Eric then head off home, and the two have a conversation about Andy's love affairs. Eric mentions a Canadian named Natalie, but Andy shrugs it off, telling him that she's gone home and that he's already with Claire. As the two continue to talk more about Claire, Andy thinks back to how he dragged Claire to the bed and tied her up before leaving. When Andy arrives home, he casually tells the still-bound Claire about his day, how he met up with his father, and told him about their relationship. He also mentions buying her a puzzle and texting her mother that she's okay. As Claire is finally untied, she tries to reason with Andy that her mother will start getting suspicious and eventually find out what's happening. Afterward, Claire takes a bath, and she ends up in a shock after finding clumps of blonde hair clogging the drain. Since she's a brunette, Claire knows for sure that they aren't hers. While he's tying her up again, Claire is already drained from everything that's happened. She tries softly pleading with Andy, assuring him that there's nowhere left for her to go. To her surprise, Andy seems to take pity on her as he loosens the ties before leaving. With Andy gone, Claire escapes, and she starts rummaging through the apartment, going through everything until she eventually finds a screwdriver. In Andy's school, a co-teacher, Peter, asks Andy about his date. Andy only ignores him, however, as he sees another co-teacher named Jana using his coffee mug. Jana apologizes, washes the mug, and pats him on the arm, making Andy look disgusted and angry. When Andy arrives home, he finds Claire seated by the table, working on the puzzle. She invites Andy over, and the two work together as Claire carefully waits for the right time to use the screwdriver. She points out certain pieces that don't seem to fit, and Andy happily helps her find the right piece. While Andy's placing the piece in its proper position, Claire stabs Andy's hand straight through the table, grabs the keys to the door, and runs outside to escape. Andy pulls his hand from the screwdriver, then chases Claire all the way down. While trying to escape, she gets to a door and desperately starts pushing and pulling to get it open. Just as she's finally starting to open it, Andy catches up to her and slams the door right on her fingers. Claire screams in pain when one of her fingers gets dislocated, and Andy tries to calm her while also realigning her finger. After the encounter, Andy carries an unconscious Claire back to the room. Back at Eric's home, Andy and his father meet up again over a game of chess. Eric tells him that his mother is looking for him, but Andy ignores the very idea. Afterwards, Eric notices his hand and asks about it, noting that it's already infected. Andy just makes up an excuse in response and shifts his focus back to the game. After this, Andy gets home and goes next to Claire. She plays some music and tells Andy that she misses her mother, but Andy just rejects the idea, insisting that he is all she would ever need. Back in Andy's school, Andy instructs a gym class and starts focusing on Franca, the student from his English class. The two lock eyes from time to time, with a growing tension surrounding them. Meanwhile, in Andy's home, Claire finds a paper clip and uses it to pick the lock at the door. She continues to try and fail until the paper clip eventually breaks, leaving a portion of it inside the doorknob. Later on, Andy arrives, removes Claire's bandages, and gives her a bath, reassuring her that they are a team and that he will take care of her. Suddenly, someone knocks at the door. Andy answers it and is surprised to see Franca, who came to address what had happened in the gym class earlier. While Franca's talking, she sees Claire and greets her, causing Andy to close the door and confront his student. He insists that there was nothing there and tells her to leave. When Andy returned, Claire asks about Franca, only to be swayed off as Andy instructs her to turn around so he can start cutting her hair. After taking a few pictures of her, Andy tries to go inside his room, but the door won't open. Claire freezes in fear as Andy asked her if she had anything to do with it, but eventually, the door opens, leaving Claire outside to cry in relief. The next day, Andy surprises Claire with new lingerie. Claire tries it on and starts dancing for Andy, who tells her to stop and asks her to just be normal. Claire retorts that he's abnormal, causing him to slap her and leave for his father's house. All alone, Claire moves around the apartment, playing around until the electricity goes out. When the morning comes, Claire gets up and looks out of the frosted windows peacefully as she watches the snow fall to the ground. While trapped inside the solitary apartment, Claire basks in her isolation, starting a fire, cooking food, reading up, and taking pictures of herself. Meanwhile, in Eric's home, an annoyed Andy asks his father why he didn't wake him. This is when he discovers that Eric has passed, surprising him. The next day, Andy calls Stefan to tell him about what happened, and he waits for the paramedics to eventually get his father's corpse. Finally, Andy returns to his home and breaks down in front of Claire. She comforts him and embraces him as Andy lets out all of his emotions. Afterwards, the two kiss and make love again. In the Christmas season, Claire and Andy celebrate the holidays by making cakes, giving presents, and enjoying their time together. During this time, Claire asks Andy all sorts of questions about her, trying to find the reason why he chose her and what happened to the previous girl before her. As Claire asks her questions, Andy starts zoning out with frustration and aggression beginning to fill his eyes. Noticing this, Claire starts to move away from the topic until Andy stops her, instructing her to close her eyes. Despite her reluctance, Claire does as she's told, worried and anxious about what he might do to her. However, Andy simply surprises her with a dog named Lotta. He leaves the room, and Claire cries out in a mix of fear and relief as she holds on to her new companion. The pair goes to a forest blanketed by snow. Claire wears a look of solace and happiness as she walks outside for the first time since being held inside the apartment. With Claire's back turned from Andy, he appears to be preparing to strike at her, but a boy suddenly cries out for help. They approach the two boys, and Andy helps the boy that hurt his leg. While he tends to the injured child, Claire speaks to the other one, asking him for help. However, the boy doesn't understand her, and he tells her to let him go, making Andy overhear this. When the mother of the two boys calls out to them, Andy looks at Claire disappointedly. While the pair make their way back to the car, Andy asks how their trip is going, and Claire rates it at a 7. Looking disappointed, Andy lets Claire in the trunk. Back in Andy's apartment, he takes pictures of Claire surrounded by Christmas lights. Afterwards, Claire plays with Lotta before Andy takes her out for a walk. When Andy returns, Lotta is gone, and he tells Claire that she ran away. Andy leaves and meets up with his colleague, only to be surprised that there's a party going on. Andy begins zoning out, and an anxious look creeps to him as many people surround him. In Andy's apartment, Claire unlocks Andy's room and finds her camera, a massage chair, and an album of her photos. While looking through the room, Claire finds another album showcasing Natalie, Andy's former fixation, with the same kinds of photos she had. Back at the party, Andy walks toward the sink but is stopped by Jana. She grabs his arm again, but Andy immediately pulls it away, asking her why she's always throwing herself at men. Insulted, Jana tells Andy to leave. In the apartment, Claire stares outside the window, lightly crying as she watches the fireworks go off. When Andy walks to his car, he notices a woman's scarf on the floor. He picks it up and talks to the woman, trying to charm her with the same words he used on Claire. However, the woman's friend calls her, and she leaves Andy looking humiliated. From the apartment windows, Claire spots a light outside. She breaks one of the windows and starts screaming for help. A man notices her and makes his way towards the apartment. While the man's coming up the stairs, Claire's screams grow louder and more desperate. When the man arrives at the door, it becomes too late for Claire as Andy hits the man on the head with a crowbar. Claire could only cry in horror as she listens to her only chance of escape being hit by a crowbar repeatedly. Once done, Andy cleans up the body, then pulls Claire to him, telling her that this is her fault and that they should clean this up together. After cleaning up, Andy tells Claire to take her clothes off, but she declines. Andy then pulls the corpse all the way down and burns it while Claire watches from the window. Andy returns and boards up the broken window. As Andy reads a newspaper, he finds an article about Claire, so he instructs her to start packing. As she approaches Andy, she notices Franca's notebook on his table. Claire then burns her hand on purpose and takes the notebook. The next day, Andy prepares to leave, taking all of the notebooks with him. Claire stares at the door, hoping that this time, she can finally escape. In class, Franca opens her notebook and finds a photo of Claire, gagged and bound. Franca realizes what's happening, and she quickly asks to be excused from class to call for help. As she leaves, she drops the photo, causing her other classmates to look at it, causing a commotion. Andy calls their attention and asks what's wrong. One of the students hands the photo over, making Andy realize what Claire has done. Andy rushes out of the class and drives straight to the apartment. Stuck in traffic, he's forced to get out of his car and start running to his house instead, where he finds Franca's bike outside. As he moves further, he finds the box where he keeps the keys all smashed up. Upon seeing this, Andy rushes up to the apartment and finds no one until he hears footsteps from above. Andy gets his crowbar and breaks down the door of the unit above. He searches the room, but no one is there, either. All of a sudden, he hears Claire's voice, telling him that she's down at the apartment. Andy follows her voice and returns there in search of Claire. As he searches inside, Claire stands by the door, calling out to Andy again. Andy sees her and is shocked when Claire closes the door, locking Andy inside. Claire lets out a cry of relief and calls Franca out, telling her that it's safe. In a car, Claire reflects on what had happened, then finally wears the necklace her mother gave her. Meanwhile, in the apartment, Andy sits on his massage chair. He's in deep thought as he had just been tricked in the way he tricked Claire and Natalie. As Claire rolls down the car windows, she cries in happiness, freed now from the nightmare Andy brought upon her.